Vamos a empezar esta conversación. Les damos la bienvenida, damos inicio a este evento bastante improvisado, que esperamos con muchas ansias y estamos muy emocionados de esta amplia participación. Primero que nada, bueno, bienvenidos y agradecer a Niels Hazekamp de Both Ends, que ha estado de acuerdo en compartir con nosotros su experiencia como parte de este caso. Antes que nada, quisiera darle la palabra a nuestras traductoras para que nos expliquen cómo va a ser el tema de la traducción simultánea. Pues si bien yo les estoy hablando en español, nuestro invitado especial nos hablará en inglés. Así que, María Angélica, te doy la palabra para que expliques.
Gracias. Thank you. Bueno, first of all, good morning. My name is María Angélica. And today my colleague Flavia and myself will provide Spanish and English interpretation with Marv Language Services to ensure that we can all participate in this space regardless of the language that we choose between Spanish and English. So today we'll provide the interpretation through the Zoom feature. If you are joining us from your computer, at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you are going to see, Victor, if you can please share the screen. Thank you so much. So if you're joining us from your computer, at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you're going to see a little globe that says interpretation. When you click on it, you can choose Spanish if you want to listen in Spanish, and English if you want to listen in English. If you are bilingual and would like to listen to the original audio, which will be in both languages, then you can have your interpretation off. Can you please show the previous slide, the one where it says computer and mobile? And if you're joining us from your phone, at the bottom right-hand corner, there is 3 little dots that say more. When you touch the 3 dots, you're going to see language interpretation, and then you can choose whichever language you prefer. Thank you. So on the screen, you can see at the top what it looks like on your computer screen, and at the bottom, you can see what it looks like on your phone screen. And feel free to express yourself in any language that you would like between Spanish and English. Thank you. Buenas tardes, buenos días. Mi nombre es María Angélica, mis pronombres son ella y ellas, y hoy mi colega Flavia y yo estaremos proveyendo interpretación con Marv Language Services para asegurarnos de que todos podamos tener acceso a esta información y participar en el idioma que deseemos entre el español y el inglés. Hoy la reunión va a ser bilingüe, entonces les vamos a compartir cómo activar la interpretación en Zoom. Si nos acompañan desde su computador, en la esquina de abajo a mano derecha van a ver un globo que dice interpretación. Cuando le hacen clic pueden escoger español si quieren escuchar en español, inglés si quieren escuchar en inglés, o si son bilingües y quieren escuchar el audio original, que va a ser en español y en inglés en ciertos puntos, pueden tener su interpretación apagada. Si nos están acompañando desde su teléfono, en la esquina de abajo a mano derecha de su pantalla hay 3 punticos que dicen más o more. Cuando tocan los puntos pueden elegir interpretación de idiomas o language interpretation y ahí eligen su idioma preferido. Aquí pueden ver en la pantalla que arriba muestra cómo luce la herramienta de interpretación en el computador y abajo cómo luce en el teléfono. Y siéntanse libres de participar en cualquier idioma el día de hoy, entre el español y el inglés, y se les estará interpretando en el idioma puesto en todo momento. Gracias. Thank you.
Bien. Bueno, entonces bienvenidos a este conversatorio. Parto entonces por presentar y agradecer a nuestro invitado especial Niels. Él, con apenas 29 años de edad, representó a la organización Both Ends en la corte holandesa que falló en favor del clima el pasado 26 de mayo, haciéndonos muy felices a todos. Both Ends es una organización con una larga trayectoria a favor de la justicia ambiental. En AIDA tenemos la suerte de ser aliados estratégicos de Both Ends en diversas iniciativas de diferente índole. y en el caso de Shell, both ends fue una de las partes demandantes. La jornada de hoy entonces esperamos sea una conversación informal. Niels nos va a contar un poco sobre el caso y luego abriremos espacio para preguntas e interacción del público. Pueden ir anotando sobre la marcha cualquier pregunta que tengan en el chat y luego las leeremos y serán atendidas al final de la exposición de Niels, o también pueden levantar la mano al final de la exposición y ahí se les dará la palabra para que puedan ustedes mismos, ustedes mismas expresarse. Contamos con 1 hora y media en total de conversación. Bueno, antes de pasar el micrófono a Niels, quería simplemente comentar lo que implica esta victoria contra Shell para nosotros, que somos organizaciones ambientalistas de Latinoamérica. Si bien aún queda la implementación por delante, que estamos seguras no será fácil, este triunfo es desde ya un gran paso hacia la justicia climática. Como todos sabemos, Shell es uno de los mayores principales productores y proveedores de combustibles fósiles en el mundo y ha estado haciendo negocios que ponen en riesgo nuestro frágil equilibrio planetario y los derechos humanos de la gente por muchísimo tiempo. Por fin y por suerte ya el mundo se está dando cuenta y está reconociendo que las empresas tienen el deber de respetar los derechos humanos y el equilibrio de nuestro planeta, nuestro mundo natural. De hecho, creemos que yendo más allá, las empresas deberían ayudar a restaurar el medio ambiente, sobre todo aquellas empresas que se han enriquecido a costa de la naturaleza y del bienestar de las personas. Esta sentencia es sin duda un paso hacia ese entendimiento. Lo que a nosotros nos sucede como ambientalistas y sobre todo porque en nuestra organización y muchos de los presentes aquí son abogados que litigan en favor del ambiente y del clima, es que nos hace muy feliz ver que los sistemas judiciales son una herramienta efectiva para avanzar hacia la justicia climática. Eso nos da mucha esperanza y nos da también ímpetu para seguir haciendo lo que hacemos y sobre todo seguir afinando nuestras estrategias y nuestras conversaciones, nuestras alianzas, abriendo oportunidades de ayudarnos mutuamente, de aprender los unos de los otros, o sea, aprovechar todo lo que vamos avanzando entre todos. Y en este contexto, la comunidad de práctica, que es un espacio que estamos facilitando desde ahí, es algo muy interesante y esperamos que pueda seguir fortaleciéndose y creciendo con la participación de todas las personas que están hoy día aquí. Así que bueno, con eso entonces paso el micrófono a Niels. Muchas gracias, Niels. The floor is yours.
All right, now you should be able to hear me. Perfect. Yeah, thank you all very much for joining, although I can't see all your faces and sure you're listening. So thanks again for joining. I'll try to share my screen, so because I prepared a little presentation. All right, now you should be able to see my, yeah. Okay, perfect. So let's start. This court case has been incredible. It's been a very long-term project, so to say. It's been many years since we filed the court case, and in the end we have it resulted in a great victory. So to put it in one slide, we won. And what I would like to do is to share some experiences with you on the road that both ends and all the other claimants took to file the court case and to achieve this result. So on this picture, you can see the lawyer. If you can see my mouse, well, it's the guy next to the guy with the hat, because the guy with the hat is actually the director of Milieudefensie, so Friends of the Earth Netherlands. And you can see myself and the other representatives of the claimants. And the pictures you see in the background is actually all these 17,000, more than 17,000 people who supported the case individually. Here's a picture when we filed the court case. The court case has been really about people versus Shell. We wanted to make sure that it's not only people from the Netherlands, but people worldwide that benefit from bringing Shell to court. So that's why also the submission and the verdict, etc., are being translated into English, Spanish, etc. So what I will be talking about today is, well, I will talk about the case, of course. I'll talk about the results that we've been achieved, the main challenges fighting a company like Shell, some lessons learned, how it might be applied in other countries against other big polluters, and yeah, of course, now what? Now that we won, what will happen? And again, here you can see a picture of all the people that were involved in the Netherlands. So here again is a short overview of organizations supporting the case, the claimants. So it's it's a court case that has been supported widely. So what was the goal of our case? Why did we do it? Well, of course, you know that Shell is a company operating worldwide in more than 80 countries, and we wanted to make sure that they do their part, that they also play their role in achieving the climate goals to limit global warming to 1.5 C. And in order to do that, we wanted them to change their policy to have a reduction in their CO2 emissions by 45% in 2030, and in order to achieve zero emissions in 2050. So there was no ask for any type of financial compensation or of that sort. Now, the most important arguments that we used have been, like Shell already knows for many, many years, it's about 60 years, that Shell knows about the dangers of climate change. They actually made their own documentary in I think it was already the 80s, about the dangers of climate change, the impact that companies like Shell have on the climate by using fossil fuels, by producing fossil fuels that are being used by consumers. And that despite all of this, Shell really has been, actually growing and investing more and more into getting fossil fuels out of the ground instead of choosing a path towards more sustainable and renewable energy. And there was actually a point in the 90s, early zeros, where Shell tried to invest more in solar and wind, but actually chose not to do so because of their argument that the world was not ready for it. So Shell's argumentation has always been, well, we just follow the market, right? But then again, if Shell doesn't change, it's very hard for people like us who drive cars, who fly planes, and I don't know, just buy groceries at a store that have been transported there to change as well and to achieve the climate goals. So yes, consumers have a role. Yes, governments have a role. Yes, everyone has their role to play, but also Shell needs to do their part. And Shell's emissions are huge. They are 9 times as high as the emissions of the Netherlands together. And this is because we include very clearly in the case that not only scope 1 emissions, so the emissions by Shell itself, but also scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions by the consumers of Shell. So Shell is, in short, contributing to dangerous climate change, and I want to underline this word dangerous, because that implies that they have a duty to also do something about it, that they have the obligation to prevent the dangers that come with climate change. And what we also did was to really make a very strong case on human rights, to link to the UNGPs, for example, the United Nations Guiding Principles, but also the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, so soft law. And this is also something that the church was really leaning heavy on when really making the case that Shell has an obligation to make sure that, you know, the agreements that have been made worldwide on human rights, the fact that living in a safe and healthy environment is also a human right, that the nexus between climate and human rights has been really what we focused on, and what the judge also concluded that we have a point. And of course, Shell is not investing that much into renewable energy, only 4%. So the results, scope 1 emissions, so the emissions of Royal Dutch Shell, so Shell worldwide, they have their head office here in The Hague in the Netherlands, but they all have subsidiaries, they have companies in 80 countries around the world. All of those companies fall under Royal Dutch Shell, so RDS for short, and the scope 1 emissions of RDS need to be lowered by 45% in 2030, and they have a strict obligation to do so. And what's also important to notice is that it's about a net 45%. So the judge ruled that they can use carbon capture storage, offsetting methods, etc., to achieve this goal. And this is also the case for scope 2 and 3, with a net 45% reduction in 2030. However, it's not an obligation, it's more sort of a significant best effort obligation. They need to do their best, their very, very best, to make sure that clients reduce the emissions. Yeah, so we as people who drive cars. So even if Shell would appeal the reduction, the decision stands, and the reduction needs to happen now. So Shell can appeal, and they likely are going to appeal, is what Ben van Beurden, the CEO of Shell, wrote today in a blog on LinkedIn. But no matter what, they need to start implementing now. And I included a link to the verdict in English if you want to know more details, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So here are just a few lines that I picked out. You can read it later, but what I just want to mention again is the very, very clear link to human rights. And this is also something I come back on later, is that this really makes it possible to file court cases against other polluters, because of course other big polluters, let's say like the biggest 1,000 companies in the world, they have the same obligations as Shell has under the UNGPs, under the OECD guidelines, and they have the obligation to make sure that, according to the verdict, to make sure that dangerous climate change is being averted. Yeah, so also maybe the third point from below, the uncertainty of, you know, the uncertainty that there still might be in the exact impacts on climate change is not an issue, according to the judge. She mentioned that, well, the fact that, you know, there's so much common understanding of the high risks that we all face around the world, especially, you know, in vulnerable ecosystems like the Wadden. It's a sort of a nature conservation area here in the Netherlands. It's so huge that Shell has an obligation to do something about it. And the fact that that will have an impact on Shell is less important. So she clearly said, the fact that you might have an impact on your market position, etc., is well, is less important than the fact that you need to do something about preventing dangerous climate change. Maybe the last point also, the Paris Agreement is non-binding. It's states signed it. However, it provides, explicitly also an obligation for big polluters like Shell to do their part. Because if big polluters don't work alone, it's very hard for governments to achieve their goals. And then maybe just a quick clarification. The judge ruled also that in this particular case, we were able to make sure that it was very clear what the impacts on the Netherlands would be as a country and the people living in it, and the ecosystem of the Wadden, so in the northern part of the Netherlands, as well as Germany and Denmark. But other than that, the judge ruled that we were not clear enough on what the impact would be for the rest of the world, and that that might also differ per country. So the impact in Brazil might be different than in Mozambique or Indonesia or the Netherlands. So it's not, she ruled that it's not a she was not able, based on our submission, to get a sort of common understanding of what risks would be faced, and that was, she was not able to make that admissible. So she ruled that all the claims that we made are non-admissible for as far as the rest of the world goes, but they are admissible for people living in the Netherlands as a country. So it doesn't make any difference for the obligation that Shell has to reduce their emissions worldwide, but it's just something to clarify and to keep in mind. So what are the main challenges in fighting a company like Shell? So what we noticed, of course, Shell has a lot of resources and knowledge that we don't have. They're not very transparent in general. They, of course, need to publish their year reports and sustainability reports and other documentation. But of course, it's quite hard to really, we basically needed to put a lot of, or Milieudefensie and the lawyers needed to make, put a lot of time and effort into, doing research on what are the operations of Shell actually emitting, what are they working on exactly, what are the trajectories that they have for the future, all the investments that Shell makes, what does it mean for Shell if they would need to reduce by 45%, all these type of questions that required a lot of work. So that's why it also took quite a lot of time. What was Shell's strategy? Well, basically they had, I think, sort of two strategies. One was public. They used a lot of public campaigning via YouTube, via ads on buildings here in the Netherlands. They started to have this offsetting scheme where you can let Shell plant trees. If you pay for your gasoline, you pay a little extra. All this type of advertisement that Shell is doing already a lot and is doing enough. And the other strategy that they had was really, of course, legal, objecting on substance. However, not so much on process. I would say I expected it to last longer, but they were quite okay in working together with the legal team and the judge on planning dates for the hearings, etc. So they said they had arguments like Shell's already doing enough. And even today, Ben van Beurden wrote, yes, we can't do it alone as Shell. It's a political issue. You should not single out an individual oil and gas company like Shell. It's not up to the judge to decide. We obey the law. We commit to the Paris Agreement. So they really pushed back on that it's up to everyone else, but not to themselves. And of course, they said we were all inadmissible. Lessons learned overall. Well, it takes a lot of time to prepare and scale up, and also in the preparation phase, I think the first 2 years, it was only 1 or 2 people who really did the hardcore research on climate, on what Shell was doing. And then in the end, it was really scaled up. The flexibility in the team was really necessary. And very thorough. So in the end, we had a broad alliance, and I think that really helped. So it was not Milieudefensie was the organization that started the court case, that came up with the idea, and then both ends joined from the perspective of the partners that we have in the global south, as well as ActionAid, the Waddenvereniging, so the representative organization, so-called, of the Wadden. So Greenpeace, many others joined, and that really built also, that strengthened the campaign also publicly. So we could, publicly fight back a little bit of Shell's campaigning, and it made we made use of the momentum, of course, of all the climate science, and that has really worked in our advantage. What needs more thought is what I already said before, is that everyone else besides the people in the Netherlands have been found inadmissible. So how can we make sure that the impacts that people face all around the world can be incorporated in such legal actions against companies based in this case in the Netherlands, in Europe, or in ExxonMobil in the United States. So overall, again, it didn't make much difference didn't make any difference for the verdict of the judge. However, of course, it could be helpful in messaging, and it's something that we are thinking about now, what to do if Shell appeals. Then something about replicability. So how can this be done against others? Well, actually, there's already a court case against Total in France by Notre Affaire à Tout, based on similar arguments. And I think there are many elements that are universal and that can be used in other jurisdictions. Human rights, of course, climate science, the responsibility of companies to prevent hazards. So for each big polluter that you might want to take on, it's important to think about the jurisdiction, of course, where it takes place, but also to link it to just common understanding, agreements that have been signed by governments worldwide or companies worldwide, like the UNGPs. That in the case of Shell has really made a difference, and it has also worked before in the case of Urgenda against the Dutch state. So now what? Well, Shell must oblige and start producing. They will likely appeal. and we will monitor in the meantime Shell's progress, if they really implement what the judge has ruled, if they are on track or not. Other cases against polluters, yeah, that's something that we're thinking about. Yeah, I mean, it would maybe make sense to also, file a case against steel companies, other oil and gas companies, large agro companies like food producers, other companies that have massive scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Yeah, so that's it for my presentation. Here's my email address. Like, if you have questions now, I'm happy to answer them. And if you have a brainwave after this webinar, then feel free to contact me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Niels. Muchas gracias. Voy a cambiar a español. Mi nombre es Javier Dávalos. Yo coordino el programa de cambio climático en AIDA, en la Asociación Interamericana para la Defensa del Ambiente. Y nuevamente queremos agradecer mucho a Niels y en general las y los colegas en both ends por haber coordinado para realizar esta primera presentación y ahora tener esta posibilidad de iniciar una conversación con las organizaciones, las y los colegas de América Latina que se han reunido aquí para intercambiar y hacer preguntas, comentarios sobre este caso tan importante que nos abre la puerta a seguir pensando y innovando en nuestras estrategias para alcanzar la justicia climática a través del uso del derecho, del litigio climático. Las organizaciones en América Latina están dando pasos ya bien importantes en este sentido y tener estos intercambios con organizaciones europeas creo que es muy importante y este es el sentido de la charla del día de hoy. Así que, Niels, muchísimas gracias y vamos a arrancar entonces con las preguntas. Nos llega una y dos preguntas ya al chat. Voy a leer la primera. ¿Encontraron durante el proceso resistencia por parte de la comunidad? Por ejemplo, en el tema de la empleabilidad que entrega Shell, entiendo que se refiere a la creación de empleos. Y si fue así, ¿cómo fue manejado esto? Es una pregunta bien importante cuando hablamos del tema de transición justa y de justicia climática, tomar en cuenta también los derechos de los trabajadores. Voy a ver, esta pregunta llegó 3 veces, entonces vamos a empezar con esa primera pregunta, Niels.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good question. Like, this will certainly have an impact on Shell's operations, right? The only way that they can really achieve this goal is by reducing their oil and gas production. They can use some offsetting, but first analysis shows that it's only a few percent. So yes, there's a real question on transitioning for the workers that currently work in the oil and gas sector in Shell. So what we have always said is the sooner that Shell ensures that they have this transition, the more time they also have to make sure that these employers can also, undertake use the transition to find another job or transition within Shell. Some articles recently also showed that there are high executives within Shell that work on the renewable energy side that's just stopped with their work because they felt that Shell is so much opposing the renewable energy division within Shell itself. So they quit their own job because they felt that Shell needs to do more and is focusing too much on the oil and gas divisions. So yeah, in the end, it's up to, for a large part, it's up to, well, the judge basically said it's up to Shell to say how they want to transition. It's not up to the judge or Milieudefensie or both ends to say, well, Shell needs to transition in this way, and they only can be a renewable energy company. There's also an opportunity for Shell to remain an oil and gas company for I don't know how many years, but then they become really small and specialized, and they offset their remaining emissions. Like there are multiple scenarios that you can think about for a company like Shell that they can undertake.
Gracias, Niels. La idea de este conversatorio también es que las personas puedan intervenir directamente. Entonces tenemos a Ivonne Llanes desde Ecuador, de la organización Acción Ecológica, que va a realizar una pregunta. Adelante, abrimos el micrófono para Ivonne, por favor.
Muy buenos días. Un saludo, Javier, un saludo a las compañeras de AIDA y un saludo a Niels y a todos quienes nos escuchan, ¿no? Muchas gracias por organizar este conversatorio. Niels, yo tengo algunas dudas en realidad sobre este caso. Precisamente hace pocos días tuvimos una reunión como Oil Watch América Latina para conversar sobre, entre otras cosas, por supuesto, sobre esta sentencia, que efectivamente es una sentencia que tiene una importancia, cierta importancia de todas maneras en la lucha frente al cambio climático. Tiene importancia porque obviamente los tribunales siempre son una estrategia, aun cuando no es la única, por supuesto. Y hay muchos casos en el mundo sobre cambio climático que están en este momento ocurriendo, entre los cuales hay casos en el Ecuador, como por ejemplo, y Javier y las compañeras de AIDA saben, Acción Ecológica interpuso un caso en contra de Petrooriental, una empresa china, por la contribución al cambio climático, por la quema y el venteo de gas en los mecheros del bloque 14. Entonces, ¿cuáles son mis preocupaciones? Por un lado, si bien tú dijiste que la Shell no puede utilizar offsets, ni geoingeniería, ni nada de eso para reducir emisiones, nadie le puede obligar a que no las use. Entonces, de hecho ya las metas que la Shell ha planteado, independientemente del caso, ya eran, y todo el mundo, digamos, no solamente la Shell, todo el mundo que habla de reducción de emisiones, los sectores corporativos están enfocándose en compensaciones de CO2 y todos estos mecanismos perversos como son las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, red, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces la pregunta es ¿cómo obligar a Shell a que no utilice esos mecanismos y al contrario que empiece a dejar el petróleo en el subsuelo, el gas en el subsuelo, etcétera? Otra cosa que me preocupa de la sentencia es que hace mucho énfasis en el Acuerdo de París y dice que de esta manera, cumpliendo la sentencia, Shell va a alcanzar las metas del Acuerdo de París. Sabemos que el Acuerdo de París es muy peligroso para el clima. Entonces, pedirle que cumpla el Acuerdo de París es una trampa que nos estamos poniendo nosotros mismos. La tercera cosa que me preocupa es que se pide que Shell invierta en renovables, que no solamente el 4% de sus inversiones sean en renovables, sino más. Todos sabemos que la masiva expansión de energías renovables en Europa están causando una devastación ambiental y también empeorando el clima. Entonces creo que el solicitar una masiva inversión en renovables también es ponernos una trampa. Y finalmente creo que los demandantes deben empezar a trasladar el lenguaje de emisiones a temas concretos, porque es muy difícil contar las emisiones. Facilita la manipulación de datos, mientras que cuando se habla de barriles de petróleo, metros cúbicos de gas, toneladas de carbono, es mucho más fácil medir y es más fácil obligar a la empresa que cumpla. Gracias, Javier. Espero que haya estado clara las preguntas, las dudas que tenemos.
Gracias, Ivonne, por tus preguntas y tus comentarios. Vamos a dejarle el paso a Niels para que las pueda responder y a continuación yo voy a leer dos series de 2 preguntas cada una que nos han llegado. En total tenemos 4 preguntas ya en cola, entonces Niels, adelante y posteriormente yo voy a leer las preguntas que nos han ido haciendo llegar. Adelante, Niels.
All right. Sorry, I need to switch between translation. Hope it works. Yeah, so thanks so much, Yvonne, for raising these questions. So if I understand correctly, you had 3 questions, one about offsetting, one about the Paris Agreement, and one about the dangers of focusing too much on renewable energy. All very relevant and timely. So let me start with offsetting. Yeah, the fact that what we asked the judge to rule is a absolute 45% emission reduction of CO2 in 2030. And the subsidiary asked, like the what do you call it? Yeah, subsidiary ask was a net 45% reduction. So preferably we want Shell not to offset any of their emissions, because we know the dangers and the just for some offsetting methodologies, just the impracticalness and the very expensive, that they are very expensive. So yeah, we don't want Shell to put too much energy and time into planting trees, for example. And what the first analysis shows is that it's also very unlikely that Shell will be able to use this offsetting too much. What it shows is that it's only achievable in such a short time frame to just stop production and stop emitting. So that's what we also will be monitoring on, and of course we'll be also monitoring the way that Shell wants to offset their emissions. But again, their emissions are so large that it's probably very unlikely that they will be able to offset that much. The Paris Agreement, of course, is a political agreement, and therefore an agreement that is political and not often not really what the world needs. We are already at 1.2 C above pre-industrial levels. The chances that we achieve 1.5 are, to be honest, quite limited. And the way that we used the Paris Agreement is to base to put the science, the climate science, into sort of a what has been agreed worldwidely by politicians, that the judge can simply not say, well, I think otherwise. So our advocates and Moya Defensie really looked at, okay, what is like a common knowledge, and the 1.5c is common knowledge. It's also been approved or reinforced basically by the IPCC reports, and of course those are also have their limits and could have been stronger, etc. And they have sort of not the strongest language, so to say. But again, it's something that a judge cannot overrule, so to say. So yeah, it's not good enough, but it's, I would say maybe it provides the level of certainty that a judge needs to rule against a company like Shell. But I understand your comment clearly, and of course we need to wrap up ambition even more to limit dangerous climate change. Even 1.5c has already so many negative impacts. And on renewable energy, maybe two answers. The first answer is we didn't ask the judge to make sure that Shell invests more into renewable energy. We only asked them to make sure that they reduce their emissions, and the only way to reduce their emissions is by limiting their oil and gas production. So again, there's an option for Shell to scale down and stop altogether. It's not very likely that they will do that. But what we at least wanted to prevent is that they would be able to say, okay, we are compensating our emissions by really massive investing in renewable energy and keeping our oil and gas production at the same level. That's something that worried us. So now that we have the ruling that Shell needs to really decrease their CO2 emissions, that is sort of prevented. But looking at what Shell is aiming for as a company, I could expect that they will indeed start becoming a renewable energy company more and more. Then I think nicely comes back to the fact that the ruling was all about human rights, and you can't change to a sustainable company, a renewable energy company, if you don't implement human rights in your supply chain when building windmills or solar panels. So I think this case also opens up a new way to have the discussion and opens up a new angle, so to say, to say, well, renewable energy should really be also environmental friendly, based, benefit local communities, etc. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Thank you, Niels. Muchas gracias por esas respuestas a las preguntas de Ivonne. Tenemos una participación grande, ya tenemos 6 preguntas ahora para Niels, entonces, como les decía, las voy a hacer en grupos de 2 y les animo a seguir enviando sus preguntas tanto por la herramienta de preguntas y respuestas o por el chat o levantando la mano para que abramos el micrófono. Todavía tenemos casi 40 minutos para este intercambio. Niels, nos preguntan desde Chile, muy interesante el caso. Quisiera consultar el valor que la Corte asignó a los principios rectores de empresas y derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas y a las guías de la OECD en la materia. es muy interesante que se vaya reconociendo la obligación de respetar derechos humanos que tienen las corporaciones transnacionales. Esa es la primera pregunta. Y la segunda tiene dos partes, viene desde Argentina y nos dicen, ¿de dónde surge que Shell conocía los efectos de su actividad ya hace 60 años? Y más importante, ¿cómo consiguieron ustedes esa información? La otra parte...
Excuse me, this is the interpreter. Could you please repeat the question, the second question, a little slower?
Yes,
Gracias.
yes. ¿De dónde surge que Shell conocía los efectos de su actividad hace 60 años? ¿Cómo consiguieron ustedes esa información? Y la segunda parte, ¿cómo vincularon a las subsidiarias para que Shell se haga responsable de sus emisiones? Lo dejamos por ahí ahora y seguimos con Niels.
All right. Let me answer the first question first on human rights and UNGPs, OECD. So yeah, really the basis is human rights law for this court case. And companies, of course, have the duty to respect human rights. And with the with coloring that responsibility, like when the judge was trying to fill in that responsibility, she found that the unwritten rule, so to say, of companies having the responsibility to not violate these rights, she really looked at dangerous climate change having an impact on human rights. So the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines were used by the judge to really like color in the indirect effects that these guidelines have on the conduct of companies. I don't know if that makes sense. It's a little bit technical, but it's quite well also explained in the verdict itself. So I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that the fact that these UNGPs and the OECD guidelines exist is because states agreed that and companies agreed that there's like a gap in the law, and that if you operate anywhere around the world, that there are certain principles that just basically are universal, that cannot be that everybody agrees on, because they are signed by states and apply to big corporations. And Shell also says we agree to the UNGPs and to the OECD guidelines. So the judge really felt that, like in the Dutch law, there's also jurisprudence. Yet if you are creating a risk for example, if there's this famous court case that a company, Coca-Cola was it, already many years ago, they put up or they just kept open a lever in a Dutch bar, and then someone fell in. So whose responsibility was it? Well, in that ruling, it was said that Coca-Cola, who left open the lever where someone fell in, created a risk by not putting up a sign or just closing the lever, etc. So this was also used in the Agenda case, and also now in this case against Shell, that being a company, when you willingly and knowingly create a risk that is so dangerous that people are dying, that people are losing their house, losing their environment, etc., that you're impacting human rights, then you have a responsibility to ensure that that risk is being averted. So that was the jurisprudence and the sort of unwritten common understanding that the judge found in the Dutch law. And then she said, okay, well, how to fill that in, how to color it in. And therefore she used the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines to say, well, this is universal, and companies need to make sure that their conduct operates so that human rights are being respected. And because Shell is investing so much in oil and gas and having huge amounts of emissions, that's creating dangerous climate change. So they create a risk for people here in the Netherlands and the ecosystem we have here in the north, that that needs to be countered. That Shell needs to change its policy to avert that risk. So the judge didn't rule like what you're doing now, Shell is already causing dangerous climate change, but there's a real risk that you're doing this, and the consequences of that risk are so vast that you need to change course. So that's a little bit more detail on the legal side and how human rights have been used in that. Another thing that I might add is that she said, well, basically everyone has to take their responsibility, so also Shell. And the bigger you are, the more responsibility that you have. So it's not that she is saying like every Dutch person has if you're driving a car, you're doing something bad and you can be held accountable or be brought to court. No, it's really the big polluters like Shell and others that need to change, so that others have the possibilities to change as well. I hope that explains a little bit more, and then I come back to the how did we know that Shell is already aware of the situation for many years? That is based on a few things. Based on Shell's documentary from about 40 years ago that they made themselves, and that was published in the Dutch media. And that's the second thing why we know is that there was a Dutch journalist who had interviews, like sort of secret meetings with people who used to work at Shell, and they had old documents, old reports that were not public, or at least not known to the public, very hard to find, so to say. And he received those documents from these old Shell employees and was able to write a very strong article about it. What was one thing else I forgot. Well, so that's basically it was in the Dutch media. The Dutch journalist found it out, and just because Shell published it in their own documents from back then.
Gracias, Niels. Vamos aproximándonos a hablar sobre la implementación de la sentencia. En litigio climático tenemos muchas decisiones positivas y luego hay ciertas dificultades al momento de su aplicación, de su implementación. Tenemos dos preguntas en ese sentido. Estoy seguro que muchos de nosotros estamos preguntándonos al respecto. La primera nos llega desde Brasil. Marcelo de Oil Watch Latinoamérica nos pregunta, ¿cómo funciona lo del 45% en la sentencia? ¿Es el 45% de las emisiones que se producen en las instalaciones de Shell, como refinerías o campos petroleros, o se trata del 45% de las emisiones que resultan del petróleo que Shell extrae del subsuelo y que distribuye. Son, digamos, dos totales distintos y pueden significar diferencias en la cantidad neta de emisiones reducidas. Y otra pregunta que viene desde Honduras, también quiere hablar de lo concreto de la ejecución de la sentencia. José Luis nos pregunta si Shell o alguna de sus subsidiarias exploran o explotan nuevos yacimientos de petróleo y gas, ¿se interpretaría como que Shell no está acatando la sentencia? ¿Es esto una prohibición de exploración o explotación de nuevos yacimientos para Shell? Esas dos preguntas, Niels, por favor.
Can you maybe repeat the second question? Sorry.
Yes, sí. Si Shell o alguna de sus subsidiarias explotan nuevos yacimientos de petróleo, se debe entender que no está acatando la sentencia. ¿Significa esta sentencia una prohibición de nuevas exploraciones o explotaciones para Shell?
I got it, thanks. All right, yeah, on the implementation and the 45%, so it's actually both, but there's a difference. So on the operations, the emissions from the operations of Shell, so the refineries, their trucks, their whatever they use to produce the oil, the scope 1 emissions, their offices, etc. They need to reduce 45% of those emissions. More, and that's an obligation. So there's they have a result obligation to do that. So if they don't do that, yeah, they violate the verdict. Then, and there's no argument about it. Then we also asked for the same result obligation for scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. So the emissions from the oil and gas that Shell is taking out of the ground and that is burned in vehicles and airplanes, etc. Those two, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions also need to be reduced by 45% by 2030. So it's the same target. It's the same net 45% target. The only difference is that the judge ruled that it's only a sort of stringent, that Shell needs to do their utmost best. So it's, let me find the exact language. Yeah, they need to do their significant best effort. So it's also an obligation, but yeah, different in the sense that it's more interpretable. So the big question will now be like, when is it enough? When has Shell done enough to make sure that these emissions are being reduced? And yeah, that would, the court is not very clear on that, so that will require more interpretation and following how Shell wants to do that. Again, it's such a high target that it's, well, at least two people that are even more into this issue than I am, who argue, well, it's such a high target that if Shell starts to, influence to reduce these emissions, that there's no way back, and they will, at least will, be able to come a very long way, and that there's no way back, and they might even, bring along other oil and gas companies with them because they're so large. So yeah, we'll need to see a little bit how this works out, and our lawyers are also studying this a little bit better and following expert analysis from third parties, etc., on what this actually means. But it's definitely that Shell will, well, if they keep resisting, if they keep their resisting modus, which is very likely, then they will, try to do as little as possible for these scope 2 and 3 emissions. And this is something that, could be tackled in an appeal, that we also ask a judge to rule for a strict obligation for these scope 2 and 3 emissions. Then on the subsidiaries who are searching for new oil and gas fields, and if they are doing that, if they are not following the ruling or not. This is basically what it comes down to, right? So it will not, based on this ruling, we cannot say, well, this specific oil and gas field or gas and oil exploration that Shell is doing in, I don't know, Mexico is against this ruling. But any new oil and gas that Shell will search for or produce or extract, like any new oil and gas fields, will of course make it very hard to reach that 45% reduction target. So the International Energy Agency just released a new report that they say, well, if we want to achieve that 1.5 goal, then no new oil and gas fields can be explored and produced. So following that same logic for Shell, it would be very hard for them to search for any new oil and gas fields. I would say it's quite likely that they will still continue, but then the question remains, how do they reach their target? So that's something that we for sure need to monitor. And if you find any new projects of Shell that Shell is exploring, then for sure that can help in raising public outcry against Shell, and we can maybe somewhere next year or in 2 years say, well, this is Shell is clearly not following the rule or the verdict of the judge. So any intel on that would be great to share with me or with Milieudefensie, with Friends of the Earth Netherlands, so that we can monitor what Shell is doing and make sure that all new and oil and gas fields stay in the ground. Thanks for the question.
Muy bien, y justamente en relación, Niels, a estos nuevos desarrollos que pueden tener el caso, y tú mencionabas a México, justamente desde ese país nos llega una pregunta donde se recoge un hecho insólito. El día anterior a la decisión de la Corte en Holanda, se anunció la compra de una refinería de Shell en la ciudad de Texas, en Estados Unidos, por parte de Pemex, la empresa petrolera mexicana pública. ¿Esta decisión puede aplicarse a una compra de este tipo y cómo podría aplicarse? Astrid Puentes, que nos envía esta pregunta, señala el riesgo de que Shell pueda empezar a deshacerse de sus emisiones para cumplir con la sentencia, pero que éstas se trasladen mediante venta al sur global. ¿Cómo evitar que esto suceda y que se mantenga la responsabilidad de Shell en relación a estas emisiones para que desaparezcan en realidad del planeta y no solamente se trasladen, como en este ejemplo, mediante una compra de una refinería por parte de un país como México?
I'm not sure if I understand the question exactly correct, but I can go at it two ways. So if Shell would buy a refinery somewhere in the world, doesn't matter where, then that becomes part of the Royal Dutch Shell Group. So it becomes part of the obligation of Shell to reduce their 45% reduction target. So if Shell would all of a sudden buy a new refinery, then it would become even harder for them to reduce emissions. The other way around, or the other way around, is actually like, what happens if Shell starts selling their refineries? Well, then it goes out of the Royal Dutch Shell Group and falls outside of this verdict. So if they would sell a refinery to Pemex or ExxonMobil or whatever, yeah, then the ruling doesn't apply to that refinery. So if Shell decides to, I don't know, sell all its oil and gas assets and become a full renewable energy company, then all the assets that are in oil and gas fall outside of the verdict. The indication that we have now from Shell is that at least they will remain in the Netherlands, so they will not move away to, I don't know, the UK or another country to avoid the verdict of some kind. What I read in the blog that Ben van Beurden, the CEO, posted this morning. Yeah, they also want to stay in oil and gas. Also, a very large Dutch pension fund that is still investing in Shell is not really pushing Shell to get out of oil and gas yet. We're pushing the pension fund, of course, to do that for many years, but they still are quite reluctant. So the first impression is that Shell will remain in oil and gas for sure. It's likely that they will need to face that to make sure that they reach the verdict. They will need to phase that out, and they will likely start investing more in renewable energy. Yeah, so far we have no indication that Shell is trying to become a completely different company altogether.
Gracias, Niels. Ahora vamos a abrir el micrófono para Santiago Cané, que nos ha solicitado la palabra desde Argentina.
Hola. No tengo cámara, bueno. Bueno, muchas gracias primero por todo esto. No, yo quería preguntar algo que quizás quedó perdido o no entendí en la respuesta anterior, que es cómo se vinculó a las subsidiarias de Shell, es decir, para que Shell sea responsable de las emisiones de empresas que no son específicamente Shell, sino que son sus subsidiarias. Por ejemplo, Chevron en Ecuador dejó una contaminación que estaba evaluada la recomposición en miles de millones de dólares, y como era la subsidiaria y no la casa matriz, no se hizo responsable. Entonces, para evitar eso, ¿cómo es que responsabilizaron o vincularon a las subsidiarias?
So all subsidiaries of Royal Dutch Shell, the headquarters here in the Netherlands, are included in the verdict. So Shell's operations worldwide, in all the countries that they are active, in all the subsidiaries that they have, this verdict applies to. Yeah, that's my short answer. Maybe if there's a follow-up, I'm happy to explain a little bit more.
Thank you, Niels. Gracias. Tengo 3 preguntas más y acaba de llegar una nueva. Nos quedan aproximadamente 10 minutos, entonces las voy a intentar hacer muy concretas. En términos de recursos que fueron utilizados a lo largo del proceso, ¿ustedes pueden cuantificar cuál es el costo económico que lleva un caso de estos para una organización de la sociedad civil? Esa pregunta muy concreta, Niels.
Yes. Okay. The court case was solely funded by crowdfunding. So people from the Netherlands could pay their share. And so far it has costed Milieudefensie, who paid all the costs, around 300,000 euros. And if Shell appeals, it will likely cost about the same.
Great. Voy a seguir con una pregunta en relación a la aplicabilidad. La voy a leer en inglés porque llegó en inglés, entonces para no quitarle el sentido. I would like for Niels to comment a little bit more about the applicability of other countries' legislation in Dutch courts, if you have any experience in this sense. The applicability of other countries' legislation in Dutch courts.
The applicability of other, okay. This court case has been filed based on Dutch law, and Dutch law applies because the headquarters are based in the Netherlands, and well, there are some other considerations, but it's basically as simple as that. And why that is also relevant is because the headquarters of the Netherlands are they're making the policies for the RDS, so the Royal Dutch Shell Group worldwide. So all these subsidiaries of Shell are somehow governed by the Dutch headquarters. Now, other laws from other jurisdictions. I'm not a legal expert, but yeah, in some cases, the judge can decide, okay, this case, I will consider Brazilian law because it's a Brazilian company, but it has somehow a link to the Netherlands. So me as a lawyer I'm admissible to rule in this case, but I will apply Brazilian law because it's a Brazilian case, for example. So it's possible to file a court case in the Netherlands, not under Dutch law, but to use from another jurisdiction. We didn't, that's a general answer. In this case, we of course wanted Dutch law to apply because we had a massive victory in the Agenda case against the Dutch state, which was also based on Dutch law. Shell is a Dutch company, so it was quite simple. But in generally speaking, you can apply other law from other jurisdictions here in the Netherlands if that would be more strategic or just the case because you're filing a court case against a company based in Brazil, for example.
Gracias. Vamos a abrir el micrófono a Daniela García desde Colombia. Adelante, Dani, con tu pregunta.
Hola, muchísimas gracias. Niels, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Yo quisiera saber un poquito más sobre la ciencia de la atribución, cómo se construyó la atribución de responsabilidad a Shell por el cambio climático y si fue necesario demostrar cómo en qué proporción contribuyen al cambio climático o cuál fue el argumento fundamental para acreditar su responsabilidad. Gracias.
In the Urgenda case against the Dutch state, the judge ruled that the Netherlands has 0.4 or 0.5%, or the Netherlands as a country is attributing to climate change for about 0.4 or 0.5%. As Shell's emissions are 9 times as high as the Netherlands. This is a substantial contribution to dangerous climate change. So that was an important argument for us to say, well, Shell is such a big player that if they don't change their policies, it's like impossible to achieve the climate goals. Then we used UNEP, the emissions gap report, IPCC 1.5 scenarios, all these international reports or published by internationally recognized bodies. So just to establish a sort of sense with the judge, like this is something that the world agrees on, politically, in science, etc. Then, of course, many more reports have been used. For example, the analysis that if you would start the reduction of oil and gas by 45% towards 2030, that would nicely align with the same line down for that, okay, let me try to comment it a little bit different. So there's a report that shows like, okay, this is the reduction path towards 1.5 C. That means 45% reduction by 2030. Then there was another analysis that showed, okay, what does that mean for specific sectors? For example, the energy sector. And for the energy sector, it was estimated that about the same pathway for reductions would need to be applied to achieve this 1.5 C. So it differs a little bit per sector, but for the energy sector, it was more or less similar to the overall emission reduction pathways. And then, of course, it depends a little bit on how much you factor in carbon capture storage, etc. And this is also where the judge ruled like, okay, these carbon capture storage methodologies are not practical, not very viable, etc. So the judge ruled, well, you can offset, but not this doesn't limit you to have a very high target for 2030. So offsetting should only be used like at a later stage. It's not what she said specifically, but it's the interpretation that we have. So the 45% reduction target follows that analysis of the overall emission reduction pathways. And then also reports were used that show that all the existing oil and gas infrastructure and operating oil and gas fields already, if we would use all that oil and gas and start burning it, we would already, bring the world above 1.5 C, even 2 C. So we need to rapidly make sure that no oil and gas fields are being exploited anymore, so no new fields, and that the existing infrastructure is being decreased, that the emissions of the current infrastructure are decreased by 45% by 2030.
Gracias, Niels. Interesante el tema de la atribución. Nos queda un minuto y tenemos dos preguntas más, a ver si las podemos responder en 20 segundos cada una. La primera es sobre acceso a los recursos. ¿Se puede obtener la demanda presentada y saber si esta fue presentada en alguna sede especial como ambiental o constitucional o ante una corte ordinaria? Y también nos preguntan si podemos utilizar, acceder a los reportes utilizados en el caso. La última pregunta es, ¿cómo crees que podemos utilizar este caso en el proceso del tratado vinculante, entiendo yo, sobre empresas y derechos humanos que se está analizando? El tratado vinculante sobre empresas y derechos humanos. Con esas dos preguntas cerramos, Niels.
Sorry, Javier, can you repeat the last one? I didn't get it.
¿Cómo podemos utilizar estratégicamente este caso en el proceso del tratado vinculante sobre empresas y derechos humanos?
Thanks. Okay, 20 seconds. Yes, the reports used are many, thousands. Milieudefensie is translating the legal documents that we have. So for that, I can connect you to the people working at Milieudefensie. And the reports are mostly already in English. So I think that should be already helpful a little bit. So let me know if you want specific reports. I can link you to Milieudefensie and you have my email address. Then the other one, maybe 10 seconds. So how can we use this case in binding agreements? What is clear is that human rights are now, I mean, you cannot talk about human rights and separate climate change. So climate change and human rights with this verdict are just so much intertwined that any upgrade of the OECD guidelines or any UNGPs, any talk about the UNGPs should also be about climate and dangerous climate change. So when it comes to binding agreements, the softness of the UNGPs already shows that it can be used in binding legal court cases. So don't be afraid to use it, I would say, as they are already. When we are talking about binding regulation in Europe or internationally, then for sure, please include climate change in this and the nexus between climate change and human rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Niels. Muchas gracias por responder a todas las preguntas que nos han llegado. Ha sido una increíble sesión de compartir aprendizajes y experiencias para todas las organizaciones que hemos participado. Ha sido un gusto poder mantener esta conversación y esperamos seguir contando con espacios como este en el futuro. Gracias nuevamente por tu presentación y compartir todo sobre el caso tan importante y este veredicto que esperamos que sea implementado a la brevedad posible. La crisis climática no espera y creo que la justicia climática se ha beneficiado mucho por el trabajo de ustedes. Así que felicitaciones. La comunidad de práctica de litigio climático en Latinoamérica sigue creciendo. Gracias a todas las personas que han participado y nos vemos en la próxima sesión para seguir intercambiando nuestras experiencias sobre el litigio climático alrededor del mundo. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.